Actually, we've got our surprise guest here, which is super because he's a great supporter of the Freedom Association, even did our quiz a few years ago. But Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't need much introduction. Here he is. He lives down the road as well.
Thank you very much. If you had any sense, you'd have rather listened to Matthew Goodwin for a little bit longer rather than hearing from me. I think he's much more interesting and very kindly comes on my programme on GB News and is a regular on GB News. And it is absolutely fascinating to get a view of what people really think. Well, obviously today's matter for discussion is cancel culture and freedom. And I just want to begin by thanking the Freedom Association for the work it's been doing on this over decades, because it's one of those things that didn't used to be fashionable. You know, standing up for freedom of speech seemed to be obscure because we didn't have to worry about it. We had ancient freedoms. They were respected by Parliament, they were respected by the police, they were respected by the courts. And the Freedom Association realised as long ago as the 1970s that actually this freedom was skin deep, and perhaps our constitution had become so accepted that nobody worried about whether or not it needed any protection. We knew it was there, we knew that it was solid, we knew we had these rights, and surely nobody would ever take them away from us. And then we discovered that there were creeping intrusions into our laws that changed things. Some of these were political, some of them were judicial. We have invented, over the last 25 years, I suppose, a privacy law. But a privacy law directly undermines freedom of speech. So, I happen to know about this child, 19-year-old, who died, was reported by the Daily Mail, and that she was eventually named only after she died. And the court still won't let people name the individual hospital. It's been in court papers that it was in Birmingham. But we're not allowed to know which hospital in Birmingham it was that denied the right of a 19-year-old and went to court to stop her seeking experimental and novel treatment because she wished to stay alive with the support of her parents and the support of a religious group. That was withheld from us by the Court of Protection ruling that the people involved in the hospital itself had a right to privacy. Now, this is outrageous. Why is this outrageous? It's outrageous because the National Health Service is state-owned. And what is the great purpose of freedom of speech? The great purpose of freedom of speech is that it holds the mighty to account. You all know, you had with your mother's milk the 4 great pillars of the Constitution. But the 4 pillars stand or fall together. And let me just remind you what they are. They are freedom of speech, the rule of law, the rights of property, and democracy. Why, if you take away freedom of speech, do the others fall? Well, it's very straightforward. Democracy falls if you don't have freedom of speech because you can't point out what's going wrong. You don't have the ability to say, look what these goons are doing, or look what these other goons want to do. You merely have to put up with it and accept it. You do not have the ability to hold the government of the day or the apparatchiks of the state. You don't have the ability to hold them to account. The rule of law doesn't work without freedom of speech, because if you're not able to point out what's going wrong, how can anyone take it to court? What ability do you have? And if you don't have freedom of speech, you almost inevitably end up with corruption, which undermines both the rule of law and rights of property. So do you see how insidious this is? And it was the Freedom Association that worked out decades ago that it needed standing up for. And where does this privacy come from? Well, actually, it comes from the interpretation of human rights law. Now, why is this so interesting? Now, you're all too young, this youthful audience, the young members of the Freedom Association, the babes in arms. I mean, normally I'm speaking to my children who are between 6 and 16, and I'm not sure this audience isn't even younger than that. So, You won't remember David Mellor saying that the press was drinking in Last Chance Saloon. But I do. And do you know what was so interesting about that? What was so important about that is that when he said it, there was no way Parliament could directly legislate to impinge upon the freedom of the press, because voters wouldn't allow it. What did it look like when he said that? What did many of us think in terms of a criticism of that? We thought this was to cover up the wrongdoing of high officials. And therefore it was opposed. It was opposed in the popular press. It was opposed by the people because it was a law for the powerful and the mighty to protect their privileges, their reputations, and to some extent their hypocrisies. So no law, no direct law was ever introduced to Parliament to create a right of privacy. Yet we've got one. Because you see, it was brought in through the back door because politicians didn't dare bring it through the front door, didn't bring it through the state entrance, you might like to say, the sovereign's entrance at the Palace of Westminster, which will be used for the state opening Parliament. It didn't come in with a King's speech. It came in through human rights legislation and has been interpreted by the judges. And therefore, Max Mosley won all these cases, not because Parliament had ever legislated for a right of privacy, but because of human rights law and because he had the money to do it. Now, one shouldn't speak ill of the dead, so I'm not going to. But I fundamentally disapprove of the rich and powerful being able to cover up their activities. Whether they're lawful or not is not the point. And what is of interest to the public is for the public to judge, not for the lawyers to judge. And this is part of the undermining of our freedom and of freedom of speech. That is the legal part of it. But there's then been the political part of it. And what is that? That is political correctness to some extent. There are certain things that you cannot say anymore. Now, I'm slightly torn on this, because when David Cameron said we're all in favour of good manners, I thought, well, yes, I must confess I am rather in favour of good manners, and I don't wish deliberately to offend people. But when political correctness means that you cannot define a man or a woman, because that is offensive, or for some extraordinary reason the Tories are flirting, my party is flirting with bringing in conversion therapy so that a father can't say to one of his children, fortunately this doesn't apply to me, thank heavens, that I really don't want you to change gender. Or indeed, I don't think you can change gender, and that should be illegal. What are we thinking about? And this is the point at which political correctness directly impinges on freedom of people to have normal conversations. Indeed, it ties in with freedom of religion. That at what point do you say to the churches, you cannot have that in your catechism? I've been doing the catechism many times, as you would expect. I have 6 children, all being brought up in accordance with the teaching of Holy Mother Church. And I love it when we get to the place where it says, are mixed marriages allowed? To which the answer is yes, with a dispensation from the church, because mixed marriages are dangerous. Now, my wife is an Anglican, so I love pointing out to my children quite how dangerous our marriage is. But in this politically correct world, is it really going to remain legal to say that things like that are dangerous? Admittedly, my catechism is from the early 1970s, even before the Freedom Association was formed. It's the old penny catechism. But there will be restrictions. There are other things I could pick out in the catechism that are even more controversial. So at what point do you say you can't say those because of political correctness? At which point do you pass a law saying that they can't be allowed? And then you move on to the politics of deplatforming. Now, deplatforming is more sinister than you may think. I'm very glad that we passed a Freedom of Speech Act covering universities, because I discovered, I had a little protest a few years ago when I was speaking at the University of the West of England. And then when I went to speak anywhere, everyone got very keen on security. And there were lots of people milling about. And I went to speak to the Bristol University Conservative Association. And after I'd done so, they got a bill for jolly nearly £600 for my security. Now, they weren't denying me the ability to go and speak. But when the next group from Bristol University asked me to go and speak, I said, look, I'd absolutely love to, but do you realise you'll get this huge bill? And so I didn't go to speak. This isn't active protest never shuts anybody down. It draws attention, actually, to what you're doing and gets it much more publicity. When I spoke here at the National Conservative Convention, some chap came on, and I thought he was fiddling with the microphones, and he turned out to be one of those eco-protesters. Well, that got my speech publicity. No one would have noticed it if he hadn't come on. And so, same was true of Keir Starmer, to the point that some people were saying the chap was hired by Peter Mandelson to go on the stage. They haven't. Anyway, it's not the protest, it's the response that you get to try and stop the protest that stops things happening, because student groups cannot afford a few £100 for a speaker to come, when there won't really be any great security problem anyway. It's not. I had a very funny event at King's College where the room had been taken over by the left. They'd filled it up, and I got there, and they wanted me to go away, really. And I said, no, I'm here, I'll speak anywhere. And so we had the left on the right and the right on the left. And this marvellous security man, whose job it wasn't at all, actually ended up chairing the meeting. And first of all, some lady did a funny little dance to try and disrupt what I was saying, and threw some leaflets about. And then I took questions from the left on the right and the right on the left in alteration, with this poor security guard, who, as I say, it really wasn't his job to chair a meeting, but he did it very well. And after a bit of screaming and shouting, we all settled down to an interesting conversation. So I think any politician worth his salt can deal with a little bit of protest, but the effort to stop it means that you don't get the speech in the first place, and you only therefore get approved views. And that is really fundamentally dangerous. So I go back to where I started. Freedom of speech is fundamental to our Constitution. The Freedom Association was very early in realizing this. We need to protect it in not an absolute sense. There are occasions when it has to be tempered. I can't shout fire here, can I? We all know that, and I shouldn't be wandering the streets of London calling for jihad. But we've got laws that deal with that. We've got laws. I had David Anderson on my programme last night, who was the former advisor on terrorism. He was absolutely brilliant and clear that the police have all the powers that they need. So it's not politicians bashing up the police. This is an independent advisor who really knows the subject, expert lawyer, saying the laws are there to stop that. But you don't want to go further, because if you go further, you suddenly start criminalising freedom of speech. So we've got to get that balance right. I don't begin to deny that, but we must preserve freedom of speech because it is under constant attack from those who have what they think are righteous views, who wish to hold power and view the way to hold power is to stop those who disagree with them saying what they think. Look at these pillars. I don't know which one you would take down, which would cause the roof to fall down on our head. But one of them is freedom of speech, and one of them, if pulled down, the roof would fall on our head, our Constitution would fall on our head, our liberties would all be undermined by it. And we have been too complacent. I could have given you the speech about how our freedom of speech developed since Edward the Confessor. It's quite an interesting speech in my view. But because it developed, I mean, not all my speeches are interesting in my view, I have made some boring ones in the past, but it's an interesting subject. But because we can trace our freedoms back to Edward the Confessor, we think they're safe. But they're not, and unless people like you and people like the Freedom Association campaign for them, you find that the pillars of your Constitution have crumbled. And we must stop that happening. Thank you very much.